Hello and welcome to another video. Well, following along with my last video's theme of talking to you about cameras that were unusual because they were sold by department stores and not camera brands, this video will feature another camera that was sold by a department store here in the US. In this case, sold by Sears, and the camera is this Sears Easi Load Auto 600. Now, obviously, Sears did not manufacture cameras on their own, so this camera was actually made by Ricoh, a company that had close ties with Sears through the 1960s and 70s. This camera was made probably somewhere around 1969 or 1970, I believe, and was only in production for a short period of time, maybe a year or two. The camera is basically a rebadged version of the Ricoh 126C Auto CDS. So as the name suggests, from the Ricoh name in particular, this camera does take 126 film. Now this camera is also an advancement of an earlier model that looked almost identical called the Easi Load 600FC. The difference is that this camera has a CDS meter here in the top of the lens, where the previous model had the selenium meter that surrounded the lens. Now, one of the interesting things about this camera is it actually uses motor drive to transport the film. But it's maybe not what you're thinking. So the motor drive is actually spring-loaded. You initiate the motor drive by first winding this knob here to wind up the spring, not unlike winding a clock. So you basically wind this until it is fully wound, and of course being careful not to overwind. And then as you take pictures, each time you shoot, you can hear the little motor will advance the film one frame at a time without having to do anything else. Now on top of that, being that it has the CDS meter, it is actually an auto exposure camera as well. So it automatically sets the aperture and the shutter speed for you as you're shooting. So there really is only one control that you have while you're shooting, and that is the focus. Now the camera has both scale focusing on the outside of the lens barrel, which you can see here. So you can set a precise position for the scale focusing, or when you're looking through the viewfinder, it has three settings for zone focusing. One for near portraits, one for group portraits, and one for landscape or long distance targets. And there's a slight détente at each of those positions, and when you look at the scale focusing, you can see that the portrait position is at 3.5 feet, the group position's at 10 feet, and as you might expect, the landscape position is at infinity. So it should be a fun little camera to shoot with, not a lot to really go wrong, if you will. Now, obviously 126 film is not easy to find these days, but I do have an expired roll of Verichrome Pan. This roll expired in 1984. As you all know, I've had good luck with Verichrome Pan in the past, so I'm hoping that this will produce good results. As far as lighting goes, I'm going to actually be shooting a few shots with good old flash bulbs. This camera takes standard flash bulbs. And then in terms of batteries, since the mercury cells are no longer available, I'm going to be using modern hearing aid cells. Now the voltage is a little bit different. It's 1.45 volts for the modern cells compared to 1.35 volts for the mercury cells of the time. I'm hoping that the age of the film and the latitude of the film is not going to make a big difference. Now lastly, the flash does take an old style 15 volt battery, which were once common up through the 70s and into the 80s. They're no longer very readily available, but there's one company that does make modern versions of the old 15 volt cell. So let's get this thing loaded up and see what it will do. Now, what the instructions say are when you wind the camera first, and in theory, when you drop that film cartridge in, it's supposed to automatically wind to the very first frame. And it also says one full wind should be enough power to go through the entire 12 exposure roll. So we'll see what happens. We'll take the old Verichrome pan, which I've got here. Let's get that open. This is a new old stock film, as you've seen me use before. So this is new film, new as of, what did I say, 1984, 40 years ago. So the first thing we'll do is tear the packaging open. Now, for those of you who have not seen 126 film before, it comes in a preloaded cartridge where the cartridge is the entire, it's the roll of film and also the film transport mechanism. So you can see here the film, the camera will engage with the film here. It's a paper-backed film similar to a roll film with a little window in the back. There's a little window in the back of the cartridge that tells you what exposure you're on. The theory at the time was this greatly simplified loading cameras because you could just drop this whole cartridge right into the camera, which I'll show you here in a minute, and everything else is taken care of. You didn't have to wind the film, you didn't have to spool it onto the take-up reel, or in the case of roll film, which you've seen me load roll film before, can be quite fiddly. This is much easier. Now, the downside of 126, and what really held it to being a consumer type film and never really a professional film, is that because the whole film transport mechanism is in this cheap plastic cartridge, it's really difficult to hold the film in a consistent film plane. And so, as a result, really this was meant to be used for consumers and never really caught on as a professional film. Okay, so let's try and load the camera. So I'm going to need to put the batteries in, and the way I'm going to do that is using this hearing aid battery. What you have to do is take off this little tab, which is on the positive side. And these are air zinc, and so once you've taken that tab off and exposed, there's a teeny little hole in the battery itself to allow air to go into the battery. Once you've exposed that to the air, once you've exposed that to the air, it will start the chemical process that initiates the battery electrical charge. It takes about half an hour to get to full charge. The other battery is the battery for the flash. Drop that one in. And then lastly, we'll drop the film cartridge in. Okay. There we go. So, should be ready to shoot. I have 12 exposures, and the battery should be showing charge, which it is. So we're ready to go. So I took the camera out to a local nursery to take some pictures on a nice bright sunny day, hoping to take advantage of that extra light with the old film. And lo and behold, it worked. The film came out pretty well, and you can see from some of these photos there was good contrast. The camera performs pretty well, especially considering it's a 126 camera, which most 126 cameras are pretty cheap. This one has a nice lens on it and produces good results. Obviously this film has some age to it, which prevents it from being really perfect. But if I can find some newer film or even reload an old canister with new film, I think this camera will produce really excellent results. Of course, there's still the issue with the old batteries, but that's solvable and it does seem to work. The camera is a lot of fun to use for just casual shooting. Really the only thing you have to do is focus, point, shoot, and away you go. Well, thanks for watching, and I hope to have another video out for you all soon.